So what are the challenges out here? The first challenge that I see is one of branding. I know that now you have created the branding of Island of Ingenuity, and that's very good. And I hope that will give you that kind of momentum. But today, if you ask someone outside Sri Lanka, what is the brand of Sri Lanka? And I think the brand really is focused around tourism, around production of garments, textiles, and natural resources. It is not one that is focused around technology innovation. Now, you might argue and say, well, this is unfair because, we have companies like Cisco Labs or Virtuese, that are successful examples, but that's the reality. And this is, by the way, a common challenge for many economies. I was giving a talk in Brazil about 4 weeks ago. It's the same story. Brazil has great companies, but the brand of Brazil is football. Soccer is starting, very soon. Or beaches or samba. That's the brand of the country. And I think we can't necessarily ignore it because that does influence the way people look at the country. And that does influence the innovation and the investment decisions of organizations. Now, on the Global Innovation Index, Sri Lanka ranks 90th. You might think this is very low, and that's a good stimulus for you to actually go and understand why is it 90th, because these are not numbers created based on opinion. These are actually numbers based on actual data. And just as a benchmark for you, India is ranked 60th, so not that high, okay? If you think the brand of India is stronger than the ranking. So if you look at the brand of India outside, everyone thinks India's technology is superpower. And one would expect India to be in the top 20 or top 25. But you look, India is number 60. Okay, and the Indian government is not very happy about this. They want to try and change this. China, on the contrast, is actually ranked extremely high. It's ranked 22nd and is doing better and better every year. If you look at the brand of China outside, I would argue is weaker than its ranking. A lot of people think Chinese products, cheap copies, not real technology sophisticated. The reality is very different. And of course, Singapore has been doing extremely well. Singapore is the top 10 globally. So you see some interesting, notions, definitions out here, but the branding is an important part of the sales story of the country. And this is where SLASSCOM can play an important role. Challenge number 2 is the amount of investments you make in innovation. And what is interesting out here is that Sri Lanka's result on the outputs is higher than its investments on the input. Usually for most countries, you invest more and the outputs are less. And in Sri Lanka, it is the reverse story. In India has the same kind of profile. Investments are lower, but the outputs are higher. Why? Because some sectors are doing better, disproportionately better than what the general country investment is like. In this case, IT is a sector that is helping the ranking of Sri Lanka to be higher. But Sri Lanka's industry does not do enough on R&D investments. Okay? Out of 130 countries, Sri Lanka ranks 102nd in R&D investments. So clearly the amount of investments that the industry is making as a whole is something that needs to be addressed. And even leading sectors like software and IT, the investment innovation could be higher. And often a good metric is revenues per employees. If you compare the revenues per employees for the leading American firms, it is actually far higher than even the Indian leaders. When I present this data to Indian companies, many of them are surprised too, because they all compete in the same space. The clients are the same global clients. But the innovation that is there in the company inherently is lower. And so you see that the revenue per employee in Sri Lanka, I just computed it based on data from the market for Virtuosa, is even lower than the Indian players. So there is an element of innovation or lack thereof that is important to recognize out here. If you look at human capital, I think Sri Lanka has done an extremely good job in providing basic education over many decades. Literacy rates are very high, And that's one reason why Sri Lanka's population as a whole does quite well in human capital. But if you look at the details, I think there are some weaknesses out there that need to be at least recognized. In science and engineering, it's 58th in the world, so it's better than the 90th overall ranking. In researchers, so really move to the high level of PhD and researchers, 85th in the world. And in expenditure on education, as a percentage of GDP, today it is ranked 110th. So there is an interesting issue in terms of questioning whether the historical investments of Sri Lankan education are being supported today to the right degree, with the right level and the right focus on science and engineering. Even universities, I know it's hard to create top leading universities, very hard. But even small nations like Singapore, with a lot of focus, they have created universities in the top 50 in the world now. Sri Lanka, of course, does not have any in the top 100. And based on one global ranking, QS, the highest ranked university is Colombo University at position 172. So while recognizing that it's hard to create universities in the top 50, it is still an interesting question of why isn't the rank higher, or can the rank be made higher? Because ultimately, having top universities lies at the heart of innovation. That's the reason why Mayor Bloomberg decided to go with a major university as the heart of the innovation project in New York City. He didn't go and say, well, let's create an incubator. Because incubator is good, but guess what? That talent and the research component of universities is extremely important. One reason why the US is, in my view, so far ahead of other nations is because the universities are so much better, the top ones. Look at any rankings, the top 25 universities, except for 3 or 4 European universities, the rest 20 of them are all American universities. So America has this tremendous ability to attract talent, magnets of talent, students and faculty from around the world. And let me add a fourth one, which I propose to you as an outsider. I don't claim to be an expert on Sri Lankan culture. This is based on what I hear from some of you in my discussions. There's perhaps some room for questioning the culture. I think clearly everyone knows that the culture is very friendly, people are very hardworking. Because it's a small nation, you have to adjust to other larger nations, work in foreign countries, foreign contexts very carefully and very easily. Those are strengths. But there is also an interesting other side of asking some hard questions, is that is life a little bit too relaxed? Life a little bit too good? Maybe the culture is a little bit too conservative, and maybe the risk-taking is not as aggressive. Maybe the country is a little bit small, and you can't do much about it, but having said this, does it actually affect the mindset? Do you think big? So if you're in a big country like the US, your goal is to conquer the US. Your immediate market is a bigger market, or in China. Now, do you conquer the market in Sri Lanka, and are you happy with that, or do you try and look for markets beyond? So the question of goal setting becomes important. And an overall question for all of you to ask is, are you, and I don't know the correct answer to this, it's a question I'm posing to you, are you sort of in a stage of what I would term as satisfactory underperformance? Underperformance relative to your potential, relative to what you can do. Especially look at other nations like Finland or Singapore, other nations that have really gone far ahead. So before I suggest some action suggestions, I wanted to just outline some guiding principles. I think you need to be strategic about what you do, because the reality is that other nations are moving faster every year. People ask the question, well, how come I'm position X while I can see this progress being made in my country? And the reality is that every country is progressing each year. The question is, are you progressing faster than others or not? That's the question, because this ranking is a relative ranking. If others are running faster than you, your ranking will not necessarily improve. Simplicity is very important. I think life is already complex enough, and if we can make things simple in implementation, strategies, and so on, it'll be easier. And of course, speed, as I mentioned earlier, is critical. Now, I have 7 suggestions out here. I'll go through quickly, and then we can discuss them later in the panel as required. The first one is, I think, vital. Just as Mayor Bloomberg had that vision, I think the government, together with private sector engagement, needs to have a vision for innovation for the country. I cannot overstate the importance of this. Based on the discussions I had yesterday, I believe there is some document articulating this in the works, so it may happen in the coming weeks. But I think it needs to be identified as a priority for the government at the highest level. You know, if you just take the time to listen to the speeches of Prime Minister Modi or President Xi of China, you'll be amazed at how much time in the speeches they devote technology. I have heard Prime Minister Modi about 5 times and President Xi about once. And each of those speeches, about half the speech or more, has been about how technology is helping the countries become more competitive. What the top leadership talks is observed, guides a lot of actions. And I think different ways of doing this, you can appoint advisors to the president. When I was giving the similar lecture in Brazil, we had the president of the country, President Temer, on stage. When he saw this recommendations, in his own comments after my speech, he said, I will go and appoint an advisor to me on innovation after this meeting. So I think just to be able to send the signal that innovation is important for the government is extremely critical. Creating some funding, creating some coordination of the actors, because almost every country has multiple actors in innovation. I'm not suggesting create another separate body necessarily, but creating some kind of coordinating council, a national innovation council to coordinate the various things, because as you saw, the Global Innovation Index has a whole different set of parameters. You cannot become innovative just by focusing on science and technology, industry, ministry. You need to have the doing business side of the equation. You need to have the education side of the business. You need to have the finance side of the business. You need to be able to coordinate multiple aspects across the country. And that's one reason why coordination becomes very critical out here. And of course, as I said, build the brand. The brand building takes time, but it's something which is important and important for every nation to do. The second one that I would suggest is you cannot do everything. Even large countries like China and India cannot do everything, smaller ones even less so. So you have to make choices. Now those choices typically are determined by current strengths or future aspirations. Just like China decided 20 years ago, well, we want to excel in high-speed trains. They had no technology in high-speed trains. They acquired it. They did whatever they had to do. And today they are a leader in that space. So either based on current strengths, aspirational strengths, and then you have to plan about how will you do the knowledge transfer and the knowledge creation. See, what is interesting about what China has shown to the world is that it is capable of not just absorbing knowledge, it is capable of improving upon the absorbed knowledge. Okay, the traditional knowledge transfer mode was that rich countries gave N-1 technology to poor countries, and while the poor countries were grappling with N-1 technology, the rich countries went to N+1 technology. So the gap was always maintained. But what China has shown is that the rich countries can no longer rely on that model of knowledge transfer, because China has successfully shown the capability to exceed the rich countries in key technologies. Today, for example, technology of Huawei, telecom supplier, is as good or in some cases even better than the leaders like Cisco. And even people inside Cisco will admit that they are equal competitors. They're no longer inferior in technology. So the whole thing of building this kind of knowledge transfer is very important. In the software domain, India did that 25 years ago with the whole CMM, software maturity model. That came from the US. It learned from the US, absorbed it much more widely than US industry, and the leaders in that space in software quality. So the whole idea of building strategic knowledge, and of course, very important, the last point out here is going outside once again. You cannot be happy with just doing and staying inside your country. To really be competitive, to ensure that you're competing at the highest levels required for global success, you have to test yourself against the best outside. Why is China trying to export high-tech trains, bullet trains or high-speed trains to the world? Because it wants to ensure that its technology is competitive and beats its best suppliers from other countries. Similarly, I think competing on the global stage, to some degree, the necessity for a small country like Sri Lanka, but it's an essential part of building the innovation capacity going forward. Ecosystems, I described to you the ecosystem of Cornell Tech in New York City. And if you look at virtually any successful knowledge cluster, be it in Silicon Valley, be it in Finland, be it in some other country, you see those elements of public-private partnerships coming into place with a strong focus on education at the center. I cannot overemphasize the role of education, and I also cannot overemphasize the importance of reform in education. And I can tell you that I'm part of many discussions in many countries around innovation, around education, and universities have been the most resistant in the change process worldwide. And I think how you reform universities is an important question. Sometimes it's very difficult because universities are government employees or government sort of subdivisions, and they are controlled by a lot of government rules. But reforming education, preparing students, preparing faculty to work closely with industry is all very important. And I think here it would benefit if perhaps there was some kind of sustained funding through a National Innovation Fund made available for building this kind of innovation ecosystems. I gave you the example of Cornell Tech earlier. I did not mention the money part of it. Who do you think is funding Cornell Tech? So Cornell Tech, the city gave the land. The land is worth about $500 million. The city gave $100 million just for preparing the ground for building. There were buildings out there, you destroy that, you prepare the land for building. The city is not giving money for actual building. The university has raised $800 million from alumni donations. So it is the alumni who are putting up the money for it. What is also interesting is, and this is where the interesting switch is, of the $800 million, almost the majority of it is going into people investment, not the buildings. Because most people will take the money and build buildings. But really, the university is building buildings funded by outside developers on a turnkey basis, on a lease-back arrangement. In 30 years, the university will buy the buildings back. But the initial investment is going all into human capital, paying for the professors, paying for the students, and doing those kind of human capital investments, and that I found remarkable. Not investing that $800 million majority in buildings, but much more in people. And that's what makes the Cornell Tech thing very strong. Number 4 is incentives. We all know that doing business is sometimes very hard in many markets, especially emerging markets. Sri Lanka ranks 111th on the World Bank Index of Doing Business. So this is something where clearly there's room for improvement, and I certainly hope that with your support, with your encouragement, the government will simplify some of the doing business elements in Sri Lanka. I think you need to provide clear incentives for R&D investments. Often governments will say, well, I don't really have money to give for R&D. I have to put money in sanitation and health and other important priorities. And the answer is yes, those are also important, but guess what? The government does not always have to put the money in R&D directly. It's always helpful if that happens, but they are not the only source. Private sector in most cases will pony up a significant part of the investments if the rules are clear. Often in many countries, the rules are unclear about what is the tax credit, what is not. And private sector often hesitates to make the investment because it's not clear of the rules. So having clear rules, having clear benefits is important. Having benchmarks and celebrating success. I know that today we'll celebrate success of innovative companies in Sri Lanka, but celebration, benchmarking is an important part of the process of managing a transition, managing evolution. Some colleagues at Sri Lanka and Costi Group have created a Sri Lanka Innovation Index. I think that's great. You should use that or some variation of that to actually create some benchmarks for companies inside, for the country as a whole, and use that to benchmark your own performance. Because the Innovation Index is a more generic one. It doesn't actually account for the country-specific differences. So I always encourage countries to take the general model and adapt it to their own context. So India, for example, is doing an India Innovation Index based on the Global Innovation Index, something adapted for the Indian strategies, Indian context, and doing it for each of the states. And what they want to do is put the states in competition with each other to acquire funds, to get more innovative, and to improve performance at the state level. Entrepreneurship, very important. I know that many of you out here are successful entrepreneurs, but we need to have more like you. We need to have more entrepreneurs celebrated. Sri Lanka could do more on some elements of entrepreneurship. On starting a business, is ranked 63rd, but on closing a business, it is ranked 126th. So it's much more harder to close a business because redundancy costs. And failure is a very important part of entrepreneurship. So if you can't actually close and recover from failures quickly, that actually reduces, once again, the incentive to become an entrepreneur. VC industry is critical. Creating one is difficult. Some countries like Israel have done this very successfully, seeding it through a partnership between the government and the private sector, then phasing it into the private sector. But encouraging local successful entrepreneurs to become angels, business angels, supporting other local entrepreneurs, creating the kind of mentorship support for young entrepreneurs, very important. And I think somehow if you can think about introducing entrepreneurship in the school level curriculum and get local entrepreneurs to spend more time in local schools, I think that would be beneficial. In India, they have a huge initiative right now to create what are called Atal Tinkering Labs. They're setting up tinkering labs in thousands of schools across the country and encouraging young students to innovate, to experiment, and try to basically become motivated to create new ideas and projects. So entrepreneurship and somehow building stronger links between them is important, I think, going forward. The government is also an important source of innovation. Now, the ranking that you see on the top is very impressive. So, based on data from the World Economic Forum, Sri Lanka ranks 13th in how important ICT is to government vision. So clearly, the executives in Sri Lanka think that the government is putting the right emphasis on ICT. Building on that, the government should be trying to take more processes, take more results, and put the government processes online successfully. Sri Lanka is doing relatively well, 53rd in the online services index, can do better. And I think I would encourage you to look at what India is doing with the Aadhaar platform and the India stack. I don't know how many of you are aware of what's happening out there. You probably have heard of the Aadhaar identity system that was created, about 1.2 billion people on that right now with biometric identity information. But what is even more interesting is, based on that, they have built a whole stack of APIs. And those APIs are now being used to create a digital highways for key domains like finance or like health and so on. It's called the India Stack. I met with the people doing this in Bangalore about 10 days ago, and I was very impressed. For the first time, I thought that, India lost the lead in the digital economy to China. India does not have any company like Alibaba or Facebook. But I think with this, what is happening in India Stack, if done properly, and if some conditions satisfied, India has the potential to regain the leadership in digital economy. And I say this very seriously. So I think this India Stack thing is a very innovative, very interesting example of how the government can actually, together the private sector, play a very important role in changing the way the digital highways inside the country are structured. Very interesting examples out there. And the last example really is around community and inclusive innovation. I do think that the right to the internet should be a basic human right. It's a very controversial subject. Some countries have already done this. Estonia, Finland, others have already chosen to go down that path. But access to information, I think, is very important for social inclusion. Today, it's very hard to imagine a citizen who does not have access to information being fully productive in the knowledge economy of the world, including a farmer. If a farmer doesn't know prices or weather information that easily, the farmer will be less productive. And I think there's a focus on rolling out broadband that is absolutely vital. One thing that we have found from my studies in the global technology domain with the World Economic Forum is the global digital divide is actually not shrinking, it's increasing. You might think it is counterintuitive because we all hear everyone has a mobile phone, so the global digital divide is actually gone. But the reality is that having a mobile phone doesn't mean you have access to data, doesn't mean you have access to high-speed broadband data. And if you look at the sub-elements of what does it mean to be part of this digital community, you're seeing that the digital divide is not shrinking, it's actually growing in the world. And that is creating a tremendous multiplier effect in a negative way. Negative way, why? Because it's increasing inequality in the world around us. The people who are richer have better access, they have more skills, they have more resources, they're able to use technology more effectively to create greater wealth as compared to people who are poorer, who have less technology, less resources, less skills, and as a result, the wealth creation gap using technology is increasing. The rich and the more knowledgeable and the more skilled and the more technology intensive are getting richer, and the rest are becoming richer but at a slower pace. As a result, what happened, the gap is increasing. So rolling out broadband for everyone is actually very critical out here. So that's my sort of presentation. I finished just on time. The watch is winding up out here, down to 40 seconds left for my presentation, but I hope it gives you a sense of the bigger landscape of what I see are some of the priorities based on my analysis of Sri Lanka as compared to many other countries. So I have done, because Innovation Index results, many similar presentations, interactions, other governments, other countries, and I do think that you have a lot of potential. Done great work so far, you're heroes in your own way, and I think the best part is there's so much more to do, and I'm confident that you will achieve that with the leadership that you have out here, especially the SLASSCOM leadership. Thank you once again for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soumitra Dutta, for sharing with us the gift of your expertise with regard to the Global Innovation Index. And I'm sure you agree with me, friends, that through Professor's address, it has helped us all recognize the extent of innovation in our industry here in Sri Lanka and also identify how we can increase Sri Lanka's visibility in the GII rankings.